What if the bread that fed the ancient world was not a simple food? What if the grains that sustained the patriarchs, the prophets, the common laborer, and the king were doing something to the human body that we are only now beginning to measure with the precision our instruments allow? What if the people who selected these grains over thousands of years, who traded them, who stored them in granaries, who ground them by hand every morning before the sun came up, were doing so not merely because these grains filled a stomach, but because they watched what happened to the people who ate them and what happened to the people who did not? Think about what that means. These were not farmers who had access to randomized controlled trials. They had something more fundamental. They had generations of observation. They had the evidence of their own bodies and the bodies of everyone around them. And they made choices based on what they saw. The grains they selected and kept and cultivated across millennia were the grains that worked. Not by accident, by the slow, patient accumulation of human experience. Today we are going to look at 10 of those grains. 10 grains that appear in the biblical world, some of them by name in the text itself, some of them woven into the landscape of the ancient Near East so thoroughly that the culture could not have existed without them. And what modern nutritional science has found when it finally turned its instruments toward these foods is not what you would expect if you believed that ancient people were simply doing the best they could with limited knowledge. What science found was precision. What science found was that these grains were doing things to the human body that we are only now learning to describe. Stay with me, because grain number 3 on this list was specifically commanded by God as part of a bread recipe given to a prophet. And the compound that makes it extraordinary for human digestion is something food scientists only characterized in recent decades. And grain number 1, the smallest grain on this entire list, contains something that every iron-deficient person on Earth is currently being told to find in a supplement bottle. And it has been growing in the same region since before the pyramids were built. We are counting down from 10. At number 10, we begin with rye. This is a grain that does not appear by that name in the most familiar biblical passages, but it was the bread grain of the highlands of the ancient Near East, the grain that common people ate when wheat was too expensive or the soil was too thin for wheat to grow well. It was woven into the fabric of daily life in the biblical world, in the same way that any staple grain is woven into a culture, quietly, without ceremony, simply because people needed to eat and rye grew where other grains struggled. What science has found about rye is remarkable for one specific reason. Rye contains a type of fiber called Herbal, and this fiber produces one of the lowest glycemic responses ever measured in a grain food. Read that sentence carefully. Not one of the lowest for a whole grain bread. One of the lowest of any grain tested. What that means in practical terms is that the blood sugar spike that follows a meal of rye bread is dramatically smaller than the spike that follows wheat bread, even whole wheat bread. But the part that researchers found surprising is what happens in the hours after the meal. Rye bread produces a satiety effect, a feeling of fullness and appetite suppression that extends significantly longer than wheat bread. People who eat rye at breakfast consume fewer calories at lunch, not because they are trying to, but because the fiber is still doing its work inside the gut. The ancient people of the highlands did not need a clinical trial to tell them that rye bread kept a working person going. They already knew. At number 9, we have farro, also called emmer wheat, one of the earliest cultivated grains in human history and the foundational cereal of biblical civilization. When archaeologists excavate sites from the ancient Near East and find grain stores thousands of years old, what they frequently find is emmer. This was not a grain on the margins of the biblical world. This was the grain the biblical world was built on. Modern nutritional research into farro reveals a grain that is dense with things the modern diet is often deficient in. High protein content, significant amounts of zinc and B vitamins, and a fiber profile that feeds the gut microbiome in ways that refined modern grains simply cannot. But the finding that stands apart is the presence of compounds that, when metabolized by the body, produce substances with documented cancer protective effects in laboratory research. The ancient grain that built a civilization is also, it turns out, doing chemistry inside the human body that we are still working to fully understand. Think about what that means. At number 8, we have sorghum. This grain is not named in the biblical text as directly as some others on this list, but it is ancient, deeply ancient. And it was cultivated across the Fertile Crescent and throughout Egypt for thousands of years. The people who populated the biblical world knew sorghum. They ate sorghum. And modern science, when it finally ran the antioxidant analysis of the full spectrum of edible grains, found something that stopped researchers and made them look at the data twice. Sorghum contains the highest antioxidant levels of any grain studied. Not among ancient grains. Not among whole grains. Among all grains measured. And beyond the antioxidant profile, sorghum contains unique wax compounds called polycosanols that have shown a documented ability to reduce LDL cholesterol in human trials. It is also completely gluten-free, and it feeds the specific bacteria in the gut that thrive on resistant starch. Bacteria that are increasingly understood to be central to metabolic health, immune function, and even mood regulation. The ancient civilizations of the biblical world were eating the most antioxidant-dense grain on Earth, and they did not even know the word antioxidant existed. At number 7, we have flaxseed. Now, flaxseed is not always listed when people discuss ancient grains, but it belongs here because it was a cultivated agricultural product in the biblical world, and because it appears in the scripture in ways that make its cultural importance unmistakable. In Joshua, the 2nd chapter, when Rahab hides the Israelite spies on her roof, she hides them under stalks of flax that she had laid out there to dry. Flax stalks, drying on her roof. This is not background detail. This is a glimpse into the agricultural reality of that city, that household, that moment. In Proverbs 31, the woman described as the ideal of wisdom and virtue is someone who works with flax, who seeks it out, who processes it. Flax was everywhere in that world. What modern science has found about flaxseed is concentrated in one word: lignans. Flaxseed is the single most concentrated source of plant lignans in the natural world. It is not close to second place. The lignin content of flaxseed is hundreds of times higher than the next highest sources. And lignans are estrogen-modulating compounds that have been studied extensively for their effects on hormone-dependent cancers, with some of the most compelling research focusing on breast cancer risk reduction in women who consume them consistently. Add to this the omega-3 fatty acids in the form of ALA, the fiber that slows digestion and feeds the gut, and you have a seed that the ancient world dried on rooftops and wove into garments without any knowledge that it was also doing something extraordinary to the endocrine system of everyone who consumed it. At number 6, we have beans, specifically as they appear in grain form and grain-based preparations in the biblical world. This requires a slight expansion of how we are thinking about grain, because the ancient bread-making tradition did not always treat grain and legume as separate categories. They were combined. They were ground together. They were baked together. In 2 Samuel, the 17th chapter, when David's men are fleeing and exhausted, the provisions brought to them include beans and lentils alongside grain. Now, these were foods understood to sustain a person under physical stress, to restore a working body. The science on beans as part of a grain-inclusive diet centers on something called resistant starch. Resistant starch is starch that the small intestine cannot digest, which means it passes into the large intestine, where it becomes food for gut bacteria. The fermentation that follows produces short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, which is the primary fuel source for the cells lining the colon, and which has been the subject of intense research for its role in colon cancer prevention. Beans also regulate blood sugar through their effect on digestion rate. They are among the highest food sources of folate, and they produce a microbiome environment that researchers increasingly associate with lower inflammation across the entire body. If you are finding this useful, then this would be a good moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We post every week, and everything we cover here is the kind of information that tends to disappear in the noise of the internet if you are not watching for it. The next video is already in progress, and it goes somewhere surprising. Subscribe now, and you will not miss it. At number 5, we have millet. Millet appears in Ezekiel in the 4th chapter as one of the ingredients in a specific bread that God instructs the prophet to make. It was not a grain chosen at random. It was a grain that belonged to that world as completely as any of the others named alongside it. And in many parts of the world, it never stopped being used. It has been in continuous cultivation for thousands of years, eaten today by hundreds of millions of people in Africa and Asia who have never stopped doing what their ancestors did. Millet is completely gluten-free, which makes it accessible to people whose digestive systems do not tolerate gluten well. It is high in magnesium and B vitamins. It contains prebiotic fiber that selectively nourishes beneficial gut bacteria, and it has an alkalizing effect in the body rather than an acidifying one, which is the opposite of most grain-based foods. Population studies have found associations between regular millet consumption and significantly reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. Not reduced risk as in a marginal statistical improvement. Meaningfully reduced risk. The prophet's bread was not a punishment, it was a prescription. At number 4, we have spelt. Spelt appears in Ezekiel's bread recipe as well. And spelt also appears in Exodus in the 9th chapter in a detail so specific it reads almost like a scientific observation. When the plague of hail strikes Egypt, the text notes that the wheat and the barley were destroyed, but the spelt survived because the spelt was not yet ripe. Read that sentence carefully. The biblical author understood that spelt had a different growing season, a different developmental timeline than the other grains. This was careful, accurate agricultural knowledge preserved inside a narrative about divine judgment. Spelt contains high levels of magnesium. It has a niacin profile that supports energy metabolism and neurological function, and it offers a complete protein profile with all the essential amino acids present. But what makes spelt specifically interesting in the modern context is that people who find modern wheat difficult to digest, who experience bloating, discomfort, and inflammation after eating wheat, frequently find spelt considerably easier to tolerate. The research on why this is the case points to differences in the gluten structure of spelt compared to modern commercial wheat. Teddy differences in how the protein is organized at the molecular level. The ancient grain that survived the plague of hail is also, it turns out, surviving the modern gut better than the grain that replaced it. At number 3, we have wheat, but not the wheat you are thinking of. Not the modern high-yield varieties developed in the 20th century through selective breeding programs designed to maximize output per acre without regard for nutritional profile. We are talking about the ancient varieties, the emmer and einkorn wheats, that are referenced throughout the biblical text. In Matthew's 13th chapter, in the parable of the wheat and the tares, in the Song of Solomon's 7th chapter, where the beloved's figure is compared to a mound of wheat. In Revelation's 6th chapter, where wheat is priced in the apocalyptic vision as a commodity of fundamental value. This was wheat that had been developing its nutritional profile through natural selection for thousands of years before anyone tried to engineer it. Ancient wheat varieties contain significantly higher protein content than modern wheat. They contain more minerals, more zinc, more iron, more B vitamins. And the evidence increasingly suggests that the gluten in ancient wheat varieties triggers sensitivity reactions in far fewer people than the gluten in modern commercial wheat. The structure is different. The ratio of different gluten proteins is different. The bread that appears throughout the New Testament, the bread that Jesus broke and shared, was made from grain that was nutritionally more complex and biochemically more compatible with the human digestive system than what most people in the developed world are eating today. At number 2, we have barley. Barley appears throughout the biblical narrative with a specificity and frequency that tells you everything about how central it was to that world. In John's 6th chapter, the 5 loaves that feed the 5,000 are barley loaves. And this detail matters because barley was the grain of the poor, the grain of common people, the grain that sustained ordinary life in ways that the more expensive wheat could not always do. In Ruth's 2nd chapter, the entire story pivots around the barley harvest, Ruth gleaning in the fields of Boaz because the barley is being cut. In Judges' 7th chapter, Gideon receives a dream in which a loaf of barley rolls into the Midianite camp and defeats it. The barley loaf is a symbol of power. The simplest food is the vehicle of the miraculous. Modern science has produced more research on barley than most people realize, and most of that research centers on a single compound, beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a soluble fiber found in barley in concentrations higher than almost any other food. and it has been studied extensively for its effects on blood sugar regulation, cholesterol reduction, and gut microbiome support. The mechanism is well understood. Beta-glucan forms a viscous gel in the digestive tract that slows the absorption of sugar into the bloodstream, that binds to cholesterol and carries it out of the body, and that provides a substrate for gut bacteria that produce anti-inflammatory compounds as a byproduct of their digestion. The loaves of the poor fed 5,000 people. And the fiber inside those loaves was doing something to every one of them. At number 1, we have teff. Teff is the smallest grain on Earth. A single grain of teff is so small that it is almost invisible on a fingertip. And this smallness is built into the name, which derives from a word meaning lost. Because if you drop teff, you cannot find it. This grain has been cultivated in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa since before recorded history, since before the time of the earliest biblical patriarchs, and it existed within the trading networks of the biblical world's boundaries. The ancient world knew teff. The ancient world moved food, spices, and grain across enormous distances. Teff was part of that world. When researchers finally did the nutritional analysis on teff in the modern era, what they found was a grain that is almost absurdly complete in its nutritional profile. Teff contains the highest iron content of any grain ever measured. Not marginally higher, significantly higher. This matters enormously because iron deficiency anemia is the most common nutritional deficiency in the world, affecting more than 1 billion people. And the smallest grain on Earth has been sitting in the soil of Ethiopia for thousands of years as a solution to a problem we are treating with synthetic supplements. Teff also contains a complete amino acid profile, including lysine, which is the amino acid most commonly deficient in grain foods. It contains calcium at levels that support bone density, and it is rich in resistant starch, the specific type of fiber that feeds the gut bacteria most associated with metabolic health and immune function. The smallest grain on Earth, carrying more nutrition per gram than anything grown at any other scale. Modern science did not discover these benefits, it confirmed them. The people who cultivated these grains, who selected them across generations, who incorporated them into their bread and their laws and their stories and their sacred rituals, were not primitive. They were observant. They were watching what happened to human bodies over centuries, and they were choosing accordingly. The grains that survived, the ones that made it into the text, the ones that made it into the granaries, the ones that made it into the bread broken. At the most important moments in human history were the ones that worked. Now I want to know which one surprised you the most. Leave a comment and tell me whether it was the beta-glucan in the barley, the lignin concentration in the flax, or the iron content of something so small you cannot find it when you drop it. I read every comment. If you are not subscribed yet, hit that button and the notification bell. We post every week, and the next video is going to go somewhere most people have never thought to look.